Okay, I think we can start. So once again, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Sharing Sensitive Research Data, What You Need to Consider. My name is Melissa, and I'm a marketing executive at F1000, and I'm here to provide any technical support in today's session. Before we start, let's go through some webinar housekeeping. First of all participants will be muted throughout the webinar, but please do write your questions in the questions box, which can be found on your GoToWebinar control panel, which looks like the image on this slide. Our presenter will be answering as many questions as possible during the designated Q&A session at the end of the webinar, yet if your question isn't answered today, we'll be in touch with you shortly after. Also, if for any reason you need to drop off the webinar, that's not an issue at all, as the session is being recorded and will be sent to you a couple of days after the webinar. Today's speaker is Dr. Rebecca Grant, Head of Data and Software Publishing at F1000, and she will walk you through what you need to consider when sharing sensitive research data. Today, we're also very excited to have with us Matt Cannon, Head of Open Research at Taylor & Francis. Matt will be helping with the moderation of our Q&A session at the end of Rebecca's presentation. Passing over to you now, Rebecca, and enjoy the webinar, everyone.
Thanks so much, Melissa, and thanks also to Matt for joining us. Okay, so what are we covering this morning? Firstly, I wanted to touch on exactly what makes research data sensitive, or what makes one person's data more sensitive than someone else's. Secondly, the legal and ethical implications of open data sharing. Thirdly, some approaches that you might take to safer data sharing. And then finally, a little bonus at the end, how to publish in an open data journal when your data can't be shared openly. So at F1000, we do have quite strong open data sharing policies. And if you're publishing with us, you will be prompted to share your data. So what can you do if the data that you have is sensitive? And before we start, I wanted to note that the legal frameworks for sensitive data sharing differ by country and by region. So this can really only be a starting point for you to consider how you should approach sharing your own research output. So it's really important that wherever you're based, you check in on the legal frameworks that apply to you and your research. So what exactly makes research data sensitive? This is based a bit on my own experience of working with authors in academic publishing. And I suppose the first one is quite obvious, which is human data, and it's probably what most of us on this call are working with. So when you are working with human research participants, gathering data from them, you're probably gathering some information about the identities of your research participants, so information that would lead somebody else to be able to identify them. But depending on what your research topic is, you might also be looking at some element or aspect that would put your participants at additional risk. And I'll give an example of what that might look like. So thinking not just about that information in the data set that would lead to somebody being identified, but also what would happen next if they were identified. If you're doing research about particularly sensitive topics, like, for example, sexuality or alcoholism, that might lead you to think a bit more about what would happen next if this data did get shared openly. The second type is what I'm calling data impacting national security. So this isn't necessarily about humans, but it can also be sensitive. So that could be something like military secrets, for example, location of military bases or something else. Sometimes you'll see research that could potentially, if applied, support the development of bioweapons, and publishers are also quite conscious that this is the type of data that should not be shared openly. And finally, what I'm calling sensitive location data. And again, had a bit of experience in this working in academic journals. So this could be something like the location of an endangered species, could be locations of protected archaeological sites. But overall, thinking about what makes data sensitive, I think of it as being data that you wouldn't want shared in the public domain. So data that needs a bit more protection. And then just to give you an example of what it looks like when a human data set is particularly sensitive. So this is a published paper on F1000 research. You can see it's about mental health problems in children with epilepsy. So obviously this researcher or this group has worked with children, but they're also looking at mental health problems. So you can see there's an additional layer of potential risk if these children could be re-identified in the data set. And we'll come back and look at what these researchers did to protect their research participants at the end. Okay, so I wanted to start with a quick poll just to check in on some of the assumptions I've made of what people might be working on. Melissa's going to launch the poll, but we'll be asking you what kind of sensitive data do you work with? So you could say human data, maybe that's security data, location data, maybe another type of sensitive data that I didn't mention. And if it is another type, then please feel free to pop that into the chat or the Q&A box. Or maybe you don't work with sensitive data, but you're just here out of your own interest. So Melissa, if you'd like to launch the poll.
Okay, Rebecca, the poll is launched. Let's just give our participants some time to vote. Okay, I'm closing the poll now.
Thanks, Melissa. Could you share those results? Thanks.
Sure. So yes, 62% have voted human data. 28% say I don't work with sensitive data. Then we have 10% who has voted location data, and the remaining goes to security data and another type of sensitive data.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Melissa, and thanks everyone. That's really good to know. We are focusing on human data in this webinar, so I'm glad to hear that that's what most people are working with. If that wasn't the type of data that you said you were working with, actually some of these approaches are also going to be applicable to you. So when we come to the section about anonymization, I think you'll find that some of what we're saying is actually still relevant, even if you're not working with humans. So thanks everyone. Okay, so as I said, we're going to focus in a bit on human data in this webinar. And I wanted to provide some examples of what this can look like because it will differ depending on the type of research that you're doing. If you're conducting clinical or medical research, human data could be something like blood or tissue samples, perhaps genetic sequences. It could be images of somebody's face or someone's body. Obviously, you can have the kind of qualitative data that you'll get with social sciences research too. So in social sciences research, maybe more likely to be gathering that qualitative data about participants' attitudes or opinions or experiences that they've had. You'll probably also be collecting some kind of demographic information about who these participants are. Again, really varied types of data that you might collect. So could be images, video, audio files. It might be transcripts of interviews or notes that you've made about participants. And then finally, something that we're seeing more and more of, which is social media research. So that could be things that you've taken from websites like Facebook. Some people work with tweets. I've seen research based on internet dating profiles. And even though some of this can be public, there are still rules and regulations around how you can use this and how it should be shared. And I'm sure I have not covered the breadth of human data research in these examples, but just to give you a flavor of what I'm thinking about when I say human data. And when you are working with sensitive human data, there's actually a lot of things you might do with it. So there's a lot of approaches and options that you might take when it comes to looking after your human data and also possibly to sharing it. And I think the thing that most often happens, and I've put it at the end of the list, is that researchers will destroy the data set. So having collected data about human participants, conducted the research, maybe published a paper about it, I think often what happens is that people will destroy the data set and not share it. This is changing a bit, especially because of funding agency and publisher policies around open data sharing. But also because there's value in sharing this data with your peers and colleagues so that it can be reused. So thinking about what you might do with your sensitive human data, presumably during your project, you're going to need to store that data securely. So during the period when you're working on the data set, you need that data to be secured and not to be lost or leaked. You might take an approach like anonymizing the data set. You could do that before you conduct your analysis, or maybe as preparation for sharing. So removing that identifying information. You might decide to do something like closing the data set for a certain period. And I've seen this happen quite often in social sciences research, where you conduct the research, you store the data, and you say this won't be open for another, say, 5 or 10 years. And then, as I mentioned, you might be subject to funder requirements for data sharing, and also publisher requirements for data sharing. So how do you know what you need to do with this data? Again, this is just to start you thinking about some of the legal and ethical implications of open data sharing. So I'm going to be talking about this at quite a high level, and then you can have a think about how this might apply to your research. So when we think about framing data sharing best practice, I think there's two key elements, and then maybe something happening in parallel that I'll also mention. So the two kind of key things to start thinking about are the legal requirements of what the data should be, or how the data should be stored and shared. And that would be established through local legislation that's applicable to you and your research. But there's also ethical requirements, and these can be established through disciplinary norms, so what's usual in your research discipline, and also, I suppose, enforced to an extent by institutional review boards who will give you guidance on how the data should be shared or not. And then in parallel, we do have those publisher and funder data sharing policies, and I would note that these have been created with an acknowledgement that researchers are subject to legal requirements and ethical requirements as well. So if you come to a publisher with an open data policy, but you think, I don't think my institutional review board would let me share this data, the publisher policy doesn't supersede that, and publishers know that, and the same with funders. So really, when you see maybe guidelines or mandates around open data sharing, it's always in addition to these legal and ethical requirements. I'll come back to talk about what that means in more detail. So legal requirements. Often these will be defined in local data protection legislation. I don't want to say that that is absolutely always the case. There might be other laws applicable. For example, Public Sector Information Act in Ireland, I would be a bit more familiar with. So I know that sometimes other legislation can apply, but usually the first thing to start thinking about is your local data protection legislation. So for example, if you're in the European Union, that would be GDPR, so General Data Protection Regulation. If you're working in the United States, it might be HIPAA, but you need to check what your local legislation looks like. They do tend to look quite similar, but there will be some differences and some nuance depending on where you're based. This kind of legislation is giving a duty to protect data to anyone who's gathering and storing personal data about people. And it's not just applicable to academic research. So, for example, if you were working in the marketing department of an organization and collecting email addresses to send out marketing emails, usually data protection legislation would be relevant to you. So this is not written just for academic research, and it's not applicable just to academic research. And what you'll often see in such legislation is that it will tell you what you should think about as being particularly sensitive elements of your data. So I already mentioned you might be researching a sensitive topic, and sometimes looking at these sensitive elements in data protection legislation can help you to consider, well, what might be a riskier topic. So in GDPR, it would include things like religion, sexuality, biometric data. So it can help you to get a sense of, okay, like what's the kind of things that I should particularly be looking out for when I'm thinking about how to protect my participants. And a note, I've already mentioned it, but you really need to identify the local legislation that's relevant to you. So when I started creating this slide deck, I thought, well, maybe I'll just use GDPR as an example, because like lots of people from the European Union might come to the webinar and it will be applicable to them. But I had a look at the list of people joining, and somebody already introduced themselves from being in Nigeria, and there's just no point in me telling you how GDPR works because it won't be applicable to your research. And then just something else to note is that the local legislation that applies to your research, it might be the legislation where you're working, but it could also be applicable legislation where your research participants are based. So, for example, if you're a researcher based in the United States, but your research participants are people living in the United Kingdom, that means that you're actually subject to GDPR legislation because that's the location of your research participants. So make sure you think about that if that might be applicable to you. So next we have ethical requirements, and I think as researchers we might all be a bit more familiar with the ethical requirements maybe than the ins and outs of the legal requirements. So this would cover things like respecting the rights and the dignity of your research participants, ensuring that they've been able to give their informed consent and that they understand what you plan to do with the data that you're gathering. So what does your research involve, but also how will their data be shared? When you're thinking about the ethical requirements of protecting your participants, you can't just rely on what we saw as those legal definitions of sensitivity. So you can't just look at the applicable legal definition and think, okay, well, I didn't have any of these elements, so my data must be safe. You should also think about whether participants could be identified due to other characteristics. So for example, if you have a participant in your cohort who's got an unusually large family with a geographic location, and both of those things are described, you might start thinking that person's a bit identifiable. And also what will usually happen is your institution, your institutional review board or ethical review board will assess your data sharing methods. So this doesn't always happen. When I was doing my own PhD research, I wasn't really asked in depth about data sharing, but I think it's starting to happen more and more. And finally, I would say you might want to think about allowing your participants to choose to be identified, and you can do that as long as you have informed consent. So in some types of research, you might find that your participants actually find it empowering to be identified in the data set and even to be named. So you can give people that option. The kind of ethical frameworks around this would allow you to do this, and it won't supersede the kind of legal requirements as long as you have informed consent from your participants. So just to note, there's no kind of, it's not that legal requirements are more important than ethical requirements, or that ethical requirements are more important than legal requirements. You really need to think about both when you're deciding how the data would be shared. So as an example, GDPR, which is the data protection legislation in the European Union, doesn't actually cover anonymous data. So if a person can't be identified by data, GDPR is not interested in protecting that data. But ethically, you might think that you should tell your research participants what you're going to do with the data, even if they can't be identified by it. So that's maybe the ethical approach to sharing this kind of data. So I think it's always a balance, considering, well, what is the law telling me, but also what would the ethical perspective be on this? Sorry, just my screen is not moving forward. Okay. So knowing all of this about legal and ethical approaches, the extent to which the law might direct you to do one thing or the other, considering what the ethical approach might be in your discipline and what your institutional review board might be telling you to do. How can you share this data safely? Like, I think when you think especially about the legal side, it can be very off-putting to researchers who are asked to share data openly. When the GDPR legislation came in, it was in 2018, it introduced really massive fines if you share data that you shouldn't have. So you can imagine that would really prevent researchers from sharing their data openly. If you're not sure what you're doing, like, why would you share? So I just wanted to talk about some of the approaches that you can take to safer sharing and making sure that you have protected yourself and your research participants if you're thinking of sharing data openly. So again, this is just some kind of high-level guidance, things that you might start thinking about, but you'll really need to work through this yourself and decide how it might apply to your research. So I suppose this is kind of a timeline of what you might do if you're thinking that you'd like to share your data at the end of a research project. And I think I can say pretty definitively that no matter what kind of data you're collecting, this is probably the timeline that you need to follow. And I wouldn't do these things in a different order. So firstly, and this is maybe around the time that you're designing the research study. It could even be at the point where you're applying for grant funding to a funder. That's when you need to start deciding what data you think you're going to collect and why you're collecting it. So you do need a justification to be collecting all this data about people. And that will be important when it comes to sharing it later on. And also at this point, so really early on in the research process, you need to think about how you're going to share that data. So you need to know ahead of time where this data will go, who you think is going to have access to it, are you going to process it in any way? And the reason that you need to think about that so early is because ideally you're going to submit that data sharing plan to your institutional review board. And for example, if you were publishing on a journal with an open data policy like F1000 Research, we would expect you to have evidence that your institutional review board had agreed that this was the way that you would share the data. So once that's been passed by your institutional review board, the next thing you need to do is to describe your planned data sharing method to your potential research participants and to get their informed consent. So this is at the point when you're starting to recruit participants for your research study. No research has happened yet. You're telling your research participants that if they want to be part of your study, then their data is going to be shared in this way. And then after step 3 is when the research happens. So you need to do quite a bit of planning, and then you conduct your research, you gather your data, maybe you start your analysis, and then you can move on to step 4, which is processing the data as you had planned to. That might be something like anonymizing. And then if anyone in your participant cohort didn't consent to data being shared, you need to take them out. And we'll talk a bit more about consent. But if you already know that your participant doesn't want their data to be shared, then you can remove them from the data set completely. And then finally, having gone through all of the planning, all of the processing, you can go ahead and share the data as you had agreed with your institutional review board and your research participants. Excuse me. So the reason it's important to do all of the planning up front is because of this idea of informed consent and making sure that your participant cohort know what you're going to do with their data set. So I added an additional slide about planning and consent just because it's so important. And again, not to get too deep into legal requirements, but it can form part of a basis for gathering and processing data under GDPR, for example. So it's really, really important that you have evidence of this. So we would say consent from your participants should ideally be written, or at least you should record it. So it could be recorded, for example, as an audio file or as audio visual, but usually consent would be written. When you're asking somebody to give their consent, you shouldn't pre-fill or pre-tick any boxes, so they should be completely free to opt in or opt out. When they're giving consent, you need to outline exactly what you plan to do with the data. So in giving their informed consent, they need to be informed about what's going to happen next. And you have to allow your participants to opt out. So in some cases, you might decide to allow them to opt out of data sharing, so they'll still be part of your study, but you just don't share their data at the end, or they have to be able to opt out of the study completely. So there's no kind of default by which they participate and their data gets shared without them having agreed to it. So this is really, really important. And then we had mentioned thinking about data sharing approaches, being able to tell these participants what you're going to do with the data. And I think the two main things that you might do with the data are firstly data processing and secondly controlling access. And you could choose to do both. So thinking about data processing, this would be some kind of process that removes identifying information from the data set with the intention of making sure that individuals can't be identified. And then controlling access is more about where the data is stored and how it's shared. So usually we would think about this as being storing and sharing data in a repository, which isn't fully public or fully open, and only approved researchers being able to see the data set. And I'll give you an example of what that looks like. But overall, the aim of both of these approaches are to protect your participants' privacy. And these are the two options that you'll probably have when you're asking participants for their consent. So you're asking them, is it okay if I process your data? Or is it okay if I put this data into a controlled access repository? And obviously you'll need to explain to your participants what both of those things mean for them. So data processing, it's often called anonymization. Sometimes you'll see it called de-identification. The difference is usually in whether people can be re-identified after you've completed the process. I'm just going to use anonymization as a shorthand for both. And it's a process that removes information from a data set so that your research participants can no longer be identified as individuals. When you're thinking about what you might take out of your data set, there's usually two types of information. So we would think of these as being direct identifiers, and that's information in your data set that uniquely identifies a research participant within that data set. These can be, I'd say, a little bit more obvious when you're thinking about what they might be and whether you should remove them or not. It would include things like people's full names, dates of birth, their addresses, phone numbers, any biometric information that might identify them. So when you're starting to think about how to remove identifying information, these are the things that are a bit easier to spot. Secondly, we have indirect identifiers, and these can be a bit more difficult because they're not necessarily things you think of as being really identifying by themselves. So indirect identifiers are information which in combination would uniquely identify a research participant. So for example, if I was a research participant in your study and in your data set you captured my ethnicity, which is white Irish, that's not very identifying. There's millions of people who are white Irish, so that's not really a concern for me. But if you captured my ethnicity and then you also captured my sex and you also captured that I was born in Dublin and you captured that I'm head of data and software publishing in F1000, then you've really identified me. So it's these kind of indirect identifiers that you look at in combination and think, well, actually, when you have all of this information together, I know who that person is, and they can be a bit more difficult to process and to work through. So when you're thinking about data anonymization, there's a few key techniques that people tend to use. There's others, but these are kind of the main ones. And I suppose thinking about what we just said about indirect identifiers and knowing whether someone's identifiable or not, I would say this is a very iterative process. So as you go through your data set, you think about things that you might take out. You need to continually reassess and say, well, actually, I think I've removed enough, and now these people, I don't think they could be identified. Because what you want to avoid doing is taking out so much that the data set essentially becomes useless, that nobody could use it for anything else. No one will really understand what data you collected. So firstly, we have removing variables. This tends to be used more for those direct identifiers. So if you have something in there that's just not really necessary for your analysis, or sometimes you'll find, for example, an online survey instrument might collect something you don't really need. So like you might have accidentally collected something like IP addresses or longitude and latitude of your participants. You can just take that out. You can remove it completely. Secondly, we have generalization. So this is making an information point less specific. So for example, in your data set, if you had initially collected maybe somebody's address or the location of their institution, you might decide to swap that for something like a city or even a country. So again, thinking about what you need for your analysis, or what somebody might need to reanalyze your data set, sometimes it can be useful to still have that kind of information, but generalizing it would just make it way less identifying. Pseudonymization can be very helpful, particularly when you're working with a qualitative data set, or a data set where you think this person is going to be kind of mentioned multiple times, or in my analysis, I need to know that this is one individual person. And that's basically swapping names for falsified versions. So this participant can still be referred to, but you're not using their real information. And then finally, banding, and I'm sure everyone has seen this before, but basically taking specific information, for example, a date of birth or an age, and then putting it into a range. You can do similar things with things like salary ranges. So I'll show you an example of what this looks like in practice. So on the left-hand side, we have an example of some quantitative data that we've anonymized. So in column A, where we maybe had somebody's name, we now have a participant code. So we can still refer to participant 1524, but obviously they haven't been named. Column B, where we had date of birth, we've decided, actually, we'll take this out completely. We don't need to include it. And it's been replaced with column C, which is an age range banding. So now any participants who fall into that band will be included with it. And then D, we have location. So maybe where we had that person's address, we've decided to replace it with a geographic location in the UK. There are controlled vocabularies and thesauri available that will help you to find those kind of generalized versions of specific information points. So for example, if you did want to generalize a location, there's a controlled vocabulary called NUTS that you can use to do that. This can also be used to anonymize qualitative data, although it can be a bit more difficult for various reasons. So you can see on the right-hand side, we have a qualitative data set where an individual is talking about their experiences of studying medicine during the pandemic. And you can see from the diacritic marks that something's been taken out and replaced. And actually, we're kind of doing the same thing here. So instead of having the name of the university, we've pseudonymized it to name of university. So the person reading it still knows we're talking about a university, but they don't know which one. And then we've changed the geographic location, made it more general. So now we're just saying it's in the East Midlands in the UK. And then towards the end, we have somebody's name. Again, we've pseudonymized, and it's those marks in the text that tell us something's been changed and replaced. I suppose one of the challenges with using this approach to qualitative data is that you can't just rely on removing names of people and places. Sometimes the way somebody talks about a person or a place or an experience means that it's still really identifiable, and anyone who knows that person would know who was being discussed. So you can't always rely on this kind of anonymization process to make your qualitative data set safe to share. So what do you do in that case? What if you can't anonymize? Again, this can happen for a couple of reasons. Maybe in removing that information, you would completely destroy the value of the data set. You'd be taking out the thing that you had generated the data set for in the first place. Or maybe you can anonymize to an extent, but you feel that this data needs extra security. You want to really protect your research participants. You feel like you need more than just anonymization to protect them. So in that case, you could choose to use a controlled access repository. Obviously, again, only if your research participants agreed. So if you're thinking about doing this, you think, actually, I think a controlled access repository would be most appropriate for my data. You still need to tell your participants that that's what you plan to do, and they need to agree to it. What is a controlled access data repository? It's basically a place where you store your data set and make it available on a controlled basis. They are available online usually. You'll usually be able to see a description of the data on their website, but they don't publish the data openly on the web. With a controlled access repository, there's usually certain access conditions that users have to meet, and I'll show you an example. Their aim is to protect participants' privacy, and it may remove the need for anonymization. So if you're going to use a controlled access repository with the consent of your participants, that might mean that you don't need to remove so much information to anonymize so much from your data set. So this is an example from the UK Data Archive. You can see on the left we have a descriptive metadata record. So this is a data set called the Groundbreaking Study of Student Life. And you can see from the record that these are accessible under a controlled basis. So it says these data are controlled. There's actually a lot more information in this record that didn't fit on the slide. So they give us a good description of what this data is and what the study was about. I've just kind of clipped out the most relevant parts for us. So where it says these data are controlled, if you click through on that in the repository, you'll actually get a big list of all the ways by which the data has been controlled. And I have those pasted in on the right-hand side of the slide. So just to go through what these controls involve, it's saying this collection of data is only available to users who've registered with the UK Data Service. If you want to use the data, commercial use is not permitted. If you want to use the data, you're going to have to get approval from the data owner or potentially someone nominated by them to control access. And if you want access, you need to apply for that via a secure access application. If you're approved for access, you have to undergo specialist training. You can only access the data if you're based in the UK, so you have to either be in the UK or come to the UK to access it. And you can only access it via a secure VPN, so a virtual private network in an environment approved by the UK Data Service. So you can see the number of people who are going to ever access this data set are tiny. And what the repository is doing is making sure that people are accessing it only for a valid reason. So it's going to be legitimate researchers who want to reanalyze this data set who are given access, and all of the participants would know that that's the only way their data will ever be seen and reused. So really kind of rigorous controls over how this data will ever be shared. Okay, so I suppose coming back to what I said at the start, which is F1000 is a series of platforms or journals that has really stringent open data requirements. So if you're publishing with us, we will tell you your data need to be in a data repository. You need to provide us with a data availability statement telling us how the data can be accessed by readers. We want you to have an open license applied to the data. We want your data to be fair, which is a set of standards around reusability. We want you to cite the data, and we also expect our peer reviewers to access your data set. So if you've got a really sensitive data set and you think it probably shouldn't be shared openly, how can you publish with us? So we do have a set of exceptions to our data policy because we understand that it's not appropriate for everybody to make their data completely open. We know that some people work with sensitive data, work with human research participants, and we don't expect you to make that data fully public when you're publishing with us. What we do expect is that you will still write your statement of data availability as part of your manuscript and just provide us with an explanation of why this data needs to be protected, what made it sensitive. Ideally, if you had any intermediary data that could be de-identified, maybe you would share that instead. So if you were able to anonymize or de-identify, then we might prompt you to share that if you can. We will also ask you what your institutional review board or equivalent had told you about sharing this data. And then where applicable, where it's possible, we would also ask you to include all the necessary information that is required for a reader or a peer reviewer to apply for access to the data and the conditions under which access will be granted. So we could see in the UK Data Archive example, they have a big list of conditions, and we would expect you to outline some of those in your data availability statement. So this is our example that was published on F1000 Research. This is our article about mental health problems in children with epilepsy. So what did these researchers do with the data? So if you're reading this article, I have a link to it on the slide. If you get down to the bottom, you'll see they've told us that they have informed consent for publishing the research based on the analysis of anonymized data. And they're also telling us about their data availability. So in this case, the data is controlled by NHS England, so the National Health Service in England. They've given us some anonymised data that they've summarised in table 1 of their paper, and they're saying this might be made available to what they're calling qualified researchers, and they're saying you can send requests to the corresponding author of the paper or to this email address. So you can see they're complying with our policy by being really clear on what was sensitive about this data, why it can't be shared, where is it, and how could you get access. And that's all we expect. So you can still certainly publish on F1000, even if you worked with human research participants, even if you had sensitive data that you can't share openly. So just to recap on what we've talked about, what should you do if you have this kind of data and you're thinking about how to share it? Firstly, as I mentioned a number of times, you need to establish the legal and the ethical guidelines that you should be working within, and it will differ depending on where you're located and what legislation applies to you. Secondly, don't gather data that you don't need, ideally. So think about what kind of data you're gathering about your research participants. If you're not using something for your analysis, just don't gather it in the first place. And then definitely don't share any of your data about your participants without their explicit permission. Once you have permission, you can process or share the data as you'd agreed. And finally, if you come to publish, no matter where you're publishing really, so a journal with an open data policy, but you can do it on any journal really, just describe what the data was and any access restrictions that might be associated with it in your data availability statement, because in doing that you're being very transparent about what the limitations were on sharing and why this data can't be made open. So I think you can grab a copy of these slides as a handout from within GoToWebinar, and I've included some useful links. So if you want to do some further reading about any of the elements that I've discussed, we have some handy links there. So around consent, GDPR, if that's the legislation that applies to you, how to conduct de-identification. That's a really nice visualization actually of kind of different levels of de-identification and when people become a bit less identifiable. ARDC, based in Australia, have a really excellent, very comprehensive guide to sensitive data sharing. And then we also have our F1000 research guide on sharing sensitive data. So that was my last slide, and I'd be really happy to take any questions that you might have, with the caveat that I will certainly be trying to avoid giving what might constitute legal advice. So if you did have specific questions around legislation, I may not be able to answer those for you. So thank you very much for your attention.